Welcome to my channel.
The snow had begun as a gentle dusting of icing sugar over the peaks of the store, but by mid-morning it was a thick, silent blanket that muffled the world of Loch-Dhu. To most, it was a nuisance. To Police Constable Hamish Macbeth, it was a divine intervention. Hamish sat in the kitchen of the police station, his long, lanky frame draped over a wooden chair, his large feet resting on the fender of the peat stove. A pot of coffee, thick enough to paint a fence with, sat within arm's reach. Beside him, Lugs, the flop-eared dog of uncertain lineage, let out a long, shuddering sigh of contentment. "Aye, Lugs," Hamish murmured, his hazel eyes tracking the heavy flakes outside the window. "A day for the indoors. If the telephone rings, we shall pretend it is a ghost in the wires." Hamish's red hair was uncombed, and his uniform tunic was unbuttoned, revealing a thick, hand-knitted jumper. He was currently weighing the effort required to reach for a digestive biscuit against the pleasure of staying perfectly still. The silence of the Highlands in winter was a rare gift, one that meant the superintendent in Strathbane was unlikely to drive his car over the pass, and the local troublemakers were too cold to cause anything but a minor domestic spat. This tranquility lasted exactly until the sound of a high-revving engine tore through the stillness. It wasn't the chugging of a local tractor or the reliable rattle of the grocery van. This was the scream of a machine that didn't belong in Sutherland. Hamish stood up slowly, joints cracking, and peered out the window. A bright, aggressive shade of Italian racing red was cutting a swathe through the white drifts. It was a low-slung sports car, its tires spinning uselessly as it fishtailed toward the village square. It finally came to a halt with a crunch against a stone mounting block. A man stepped out. He was dressed in a quilted designer gilet that cost more than Hamish's annual salary, paired with pristine white trousers that were already being ruined by the slush. He looked at the quaint cottages of Loch-Dhu with the expression of a man who had accidentally stepped in something unpleasant. "Sassenach," Hamish sighed, the word carrying more weariness than malice. The man marched toward the police station, his face a vibrant shade of indignant pink. He didn't knock, he hammered. Hamish took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee before opening the door. "You, constable," the man barked. He had the clipped, nasal accent of the London financial belt. "My name is Julian—" He stopped, remembering something. "My name is Percival Thorne. I bought the old Croft on the hill. The road is a disgrace. I nearly lost the underside of my car on a rock the size of a sheep." "It's a Highland road, sir," Hamish said mildly, his voice a soft, deceptive lilt. "The rocks have been there longer than the cars. Would you like a cup of coffee? I want the gritters out. I have guests arriving for a wild Highland experience weekend, and I'm paying a fortune in council tax for this wasteland. And there's a local man, a giant with a beard like a gorse bush, who was standing in my field with a shotgun. I want him arrested for trespassing." Hamish hid a smile. That would be Geordie, likely checking his snares. "The locals have a way of wandering, Mr. Thorne. It's the old ways. The old ways are over," Thorne snapped, stepping into the warm kitchen and looking around with disdain at the mismatched mugs and the sleeping dog. "I'm turning that Croft into a high-end retreat. I expect service. I expect the law to be upheld. Do you understand, or should I speak slower?" Hamish blinked slowly, looking every bit the dim-witted village bobby. "I understand fine, sir. It's the snow, you see. It makes everything—" "Slow." Thorne let out a huff of exasperation. Useless, absolutely useless. He turned on his heel and marched back to his red car, the engine screaming once more as he forced it back up the hill toward the isolated Croft. Hamish watched him go, then sat back down and reached for that biscuit. "He'll no last the winter, Lugs. People like that never do. They think they can shout at the mountains until the mountains move." But as the sun began to dip behind the grey clouds, casting long, eerie blue shadows over the drifts, a different sound echoed down from the Croft. It wasn't a car engine. It was a single sharp crack. like a frozen branch snapping or a rifle shot. Hamish's ears pricked up. He looked at the telephone. He hoped it wouldn't ring. But in Loch Dhu, peace was often just the silence before the scream. The snow did not stop. By the following morning, the village of Loch Dhu looked like a scene from a sugar-dusted postcard, though the beauty was lost on Hamish Macbeth. He was currently engaged in a delicate operation involving a skillet, 2 eggs, and a slice of black pudding. The smell of the sizzling fat was a comfort against the biting wind that rattled the police station windows. He had just slid the eggs onto a plate when the peace was not merely disturbed, but shattered. The door to the station burst open, bringing with it a swirl of icy flakes and a frantic Mrs. Kennedy from the post office. Her face, usually a healthy shade of heather pink, was as white as the drifts outside. She was gasping for air, her woolen shawl slipping from her shoulders. "Hamish! Oh, Hamish, it's terrible!" she wailed, clutching her chest. "It's that man, that London man in the fancy car. He's up at the Croft and he's quite ruined." Hamish sighed, a long, mournful sound that expressed his profound disappointment in his cooling breakfast. He looked at the eggs, then at Mrs. Kennedy, and finally at Luggs, who was already standing by the door, his tail giving a tentative wag. "Ruined, Mrs. Kennedy? Has he crashed that red toy of his again? I told him the rocks have no mercy for Italian engineering. No, Hamish, he's dead, stiff as a frozen salmon," she cried out. Young Archie went up to deliver a parcel, a crate of fancy water, if you can believe such a thing, and he saw him through the window. "He's in the garden, Hamish, or what passes for a garden under all that white." Hamish felt the familiar cold knot of duty tightening in his stomach. He pulled on his heavy greatcoat and tucked his peaked cap firmly over his unruly red hair. He grabbed his whistle and his notebook, though he knew well that his eyes and ears would be worth more than any scribbled notes. The trek up to the old McCrae Croft was a grueling one. The path was steep, and the snow had filled the hollows, making every step a gamble. Hamish trudged upward, his breath blooming in the air like clouds of peat smoke. As he reached the crest of the hill, the modern monstrosity that Percival Thorne had called a retreat came into view. It was a stark, glass and stone building that looked entirely out of place against the rugged Highland landscape. There, in the middle of what was meant to be a manicured lawn, sat Percival Thorne. He wasn't lying down. He was sitting perfectly upright, in a high-backed wicker garden chair, dressed in his expensive silk dressing gown and leather slippers. A light dusting of snow sat upon his head like a powdered wig. He looked as though he were waiting for someone to bring him a gin and tonic, except for the fact that his eyes were wide open and staring with a glassy vacancy at the horizon, and his skin had taken on the bluish tint of skimmed milk. But the most bizarre part, the part that made Hamish tilt his head in genuine confusion, was the snowman. A massive, crudely constructed snowman had been built directly in front of the dead man. It wasn't a friendly, coal-eyed creation. It was towering and lopsided, and someone had draped Thorne's own designer gilet around its frozen torso. In the snowman's hand, a sturdy branch of rowan, was a silver platter. On the platter sat a single half-eaten mutton pie. "Well now," Hamish muttered to Luggs, who was sniffing suspiciously at the base of the wicker chair. "That is a very pointed piece. Someone has a dark sense of humour, or a very long memory." Hamish did not touch the body. He knew the rules even if he found them tedious. He circled the scene slowly, his boots crunching in the crusty snow. He noted the lack of footprints. The wind had been high during the night, drifting the snow and erasing the tracks of whoever had staged this macabre tableau. It was a clean slate, a Highland specialty. He looked at Thorne's face. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no obvious wound. The man looked as though he had simply sat down to have a chat with a giant made of ice and had died of the sheer indignity of it. Yet, the placement of the body in the chair, the dressing of the snowman, and the presence of the mutton pie, a local staple Thorne had mocked only the day before, suggested a murder that was deeply personal and deliberately humiliating. He wanted a wild Highland experience, Hamish whispered. I suppose he got one. The annoyance began to settle in. A murder meant the big men would be coming. It meant the quiet tracks of the village would be trampled by heavy-footed detectives from Strathbane who didn't understand the difference between a local grudge and a professional hit. It meant paperwork. It meant his cosy evening by the fire was a casualty of Percival Thorne's arrogance. He heard the distant, discordant wail of a siren. Even through the snow, the Strathbane police were making their presence known with as much noise as possible. They would be coming over the pass in their heavy four-wheel drives, tyres churning the slush into mud, ready to tell Hamish how to do a job he had been doing since they were in short trousers. Hamish reached into his pocket and found a stray peppermint. He popped it into his mouth and watched the blue lights flashing in the valley below. He looked at the snowman, then at the dead man in the silk gown. Thorne had wanted to change Loch Dhu, to modernise it, to transform its soul into a commodity for wealthy outsiders. The Highlands, it seemed, had offered a very permanent rebuttal. "Stay, lugs," Hamish commanded as the first of the police vehicles cleared the rise, its engine roaring in protest. "Here comes the circus. We'd look as useless as they expect us to be. It makes them talk louder, and I've a feeling we're going to need to hear everything they say, and a great deal of what they don't." He slumped his shoulders, let his jaw hang just a fraction lower, and adopted the blank, slightly confused expression of a man who found the concept of a telephone a bit overwhelming. By the time the lead car screeched to a halt, spraying Hamish's trousers with brown slush, PC Macbeth looked every bit the redundant village constable, just waiting to be told what to do. The heavy, black four-wheel drive vehicle skidded to a halt just inches from Hamish's boots, throwing a fresh spray of icy slush over his already damp trousers. The door flung open with such violence that it creaked on its hinges, and out stepped Detective Chief Inspector Blair. He was a man who seemed to be composed entirely of bad temper, cheap tobacco, and a deep-seated resentment of anything north of the Strathbane city limits. His face was a map of broken capillaries, currently glowing a violent shade of magenta against the white Highland backdrop. Behind him trailed the usual retinue of weary-looking subordinates, including the long-suffering Jimmy Anderson, who looked as though he would rather be anywhere else on earth. Blair didn't offer a greeting. He simply stood there, his breath coming in ragged, wheezing plumes, and stared at the scene. He looked at the dead man in the wicker chair, then at the towering, lopsided snowman, and finally at Hamish, who was standing, perfectly still, with a look of vacant bewilderment on his face. "Macbeth!" Blair bellowed, his voice echoing off the frozen sides of the glen. "What in the name of all that is holy is this? I've driven 3 hours through a blizzard because some pansy Englishman has managed to get himself frozen in his own garden, and why is there a bloody snowman wearing a designer jacket? Is this your idea of a joke?" Hamish blinked slowly, his hazel eyes wide and guileless. "No joke, sir. I found him just as he is. Or rather, young Archie from the post office found him. I've just been standing here keeping the scene, well, keeping it cold, I suppose." "Keeping it cold?" Blair mimicked in a high-pitched, mocking tone. "You're a useless article, Macbeth. A complete and utter waste of a uniform. Look at you! You look like a beachcomber who's lost his way. Button that tunic, and get that mangy beast away from the corpse before it decides to have a nibble." Lugs, sensing the hostility, let out a low rumble in his throat, but Hamish placed a calming hand on the dog's head. "He's a very discerning eater, sir. He wouldn't touch Mr. Thorne. Too much artificial preservative, I expect." Blair ignored him, stomping toward the body. His heavy boots trampled over the very areas Hamish had been careful to avoid, obliterating any subtle marks in the snow that might have told a story. The DCI leaned in close to the frozen Percival Thorne, sniffing loudly. "Booze," Blair declared, standing back up and wiping a smear of sleet from his nose. "The man's reeking of it. It's obvious, isn't it? Rich Sassenach comes up here, thinks he's the king of the castle, gets hammered on expensive scotch, wanders out into the garden for a bit of fresh air, sits down and falls asleep. Hypothermia did the rest. The snowman is probably just some local hooligans having a laugh at a dead man's expense. He's wearing a silk dressing gown, sir, Hamish pointed out softly. And no shoes, just the slippers. It was -5 last night. It's a very long walk from the warm sitting room to that chair for a man who just wanted some air. Are you telling me how to do my job, you Highland peasant? Blair spun around, his finger jabbing toward Hamish's chest. I've solved more murders than you've poached salmon, and don't think I don't know about that fish you took out of the Endure last Tuesday. This is an accident, a messy, embarrassing, drunken accident. But since there's a body and a snowman, I have to go through the motions. It'll be that bearded giant Thorn complained about. What's his name? Geordie? The poacher. He probably lured him out here as a prank, and the old heart gave out. Geordie is a man of the woods, sir, Hamish said, his voice dropping into a deeper, more rhythmic lilt. He has a respect for the dead that Mr. Thorn lacked for the living. He wouldn't be making dolls out of snow and dressing them in silk. Shut up, Macbeth. Just shut up. Blair turned back to his team. Anderson, get the photographer over here, and get someone to bag that mutton pie. God, I hate this place. Even the murders are pathetic. And you, Macbeth, get down to the village and start rounding up the usual suspects. I want Geordie in for questioning by lunchtime. If he wasn't involved, he'll know who was. These people are all inbred anyway, they can't keep a secret from each other. Hamish watched as Blair's team began to swarm the area, their heavy equipment and loud voices shattering the dignified silence of the hills. They were looking for fingerprints on a frozen wicker chair and DNA in a pile of slush. They were looking for the how through science, while ignoring the why that sat right in front of them. Blair walked over to the snowman and gave it a vicious kick, sending the silver platter and the mutton pie flying into a drift. Ridiculous, he muttered. A mutton pie. Only in this god-forsaken heap of rocks would you find a crime scene that looks like a bad deli counter. Hamish didn't move to help. He remained in his useless stance, his hands deep in his pockets, observing the way Blair's face twitched when he looked at the expensive Croft house. It wasn't just professional incompetence. It was a deep, simmering envy. Blair hated Thorn for having the money to buy this place, and he hated Hamish for having the peace to live in it. "Well, Macbeth?" Blair barked, seeing Hamish still standing there. "What are you waiting for? A written invitation from the Queen? Move! Get back to your little station and stay out of my way. I don't want you contaminating my investigation with your local knowledge and your intuition. Just do what you're told for once in your miserable life." Hamish touched the brim of his cap in a mock salute that was just subtle enough to avoid a formal reprimand. "As you wish, sir. I'll go and see if I can find Geordie. Though in this weather he'll be tucked up in a drift somewhere, and not even the devil himself could find him if he didn't want to be found." "Just go!" Blair screamed. Hamish turned and began the long trek back down toward Loch Dhu. Lugs trotted faithfully at his heels. Hamish knew Blair was wrong. Thorn hadn't died of a drunken accident, and Geordie, for all his faults, wasn't a man for theatrical snowmen. There was a cold, calculated cruelty in the way Thorn had been displayed. It wasn't a crime of passion, it was a crime of commentary. As he walked, Hamish thought about the mutton pie. It was a small detail, the kind Blair dismissed as a joke. But in the Highlands, food was never just food, it was a message. And as the wind began to howl again, threatening a fresh whiteout, Hamish knew he wouldn't be finding Geordie. He would be finding a teapot, a warm kitchen, and someone who liked to talk. The big men could have the forensics. Hamish would take the gossip. The descent from the Croft back into the heart of Loch Dhu was a lonely trek through a world turned white and muffled. Hamish walked with a slow, rhythmic gait, his chin tucked into the collar of his greatcoat. He knew well that DCI Blair would be making a mess of the crime scene, shouting at his subordinates and frightening the local sheep. But Hamish had a different method in mind. To the city detectives, an investigation was a matter of sirens, interrogation rooms, and aggressive questioning. To Hamish, it was a matter of knowing exactly whose chimney was smoking and who had a fresh batch of scones on the wire rack. He bypassed the police station entirely, his boots crunching on the frozen road as he made a beeline for the post office and general store. This was the nervous system of Lochdu, where every secret was weighed alongside the bags of flour and every bit of scandal was stamped and delivered before the afternoon post went out. Mrs. Kennedy was back behind her counter, her face still pale, but her eyes bright with the frantic energy of one who had been the first to witness a catastrophe. "Ah, Hamish," she breathed as the bell chimed above the door. "The village is in a state. That great red-faced man from Strathbane has been stomping about like a wounded bull. He nearly knocked over Mrs. Wellington's milk delivery." "Aye, that would be DCI Blair," Hamish said, leaning his elbows on the counter and looking particularly weary. "He's a man with a great deal of noise and very little patience. I don't suppose you'd have a drop of tea, Mrs. Kennedy?" "The cold has reached right into my bones, and I've been sent away so the real police can work." Mrs. Kennedy's maternal instincts immediately overrode her shock. "Send you away? The nerve of that man! You wait right here, Hamish. I've just put the kettle on in the back." A few minutes later, Hamish was seated on a stool in the small, cluttered back room of the shop, a steaming mug of tea in his hands and a plate of shortbread at his elbow. Luggs sat at his feet, looking up with a hopeful expression that was soon rewarded with a crumbly corner of biscuit. "Now then," Hamish said, his voice dropping into a confidential, friendly hum. "Mr. Thorne was not a popular man, I think. He spoke to me yesterday, and he seemed to have a talent for making an enemy out of a stone wall." Mrs. Kennedy leaned in, her voice a hushed whisper. "He was a wicked man, Hamish. He bought that Croft, and the first thing he did was try to block the ancient right-of-way that the Macrae family had used for 300 years. He told old Mr. Macrae that if he saw his cows on his land again, he'd have them impounded. And then there was the business with the curry shop." Hamish raised an eyebrow. "The curry shop, aye. He tried to get a court order to shut Mr. Patel's kitchen exhaust. Claimed the smell of spices was polluting the Highland air and lowering the value of his retreat. Mr. Patel was heartbroken. He's lived here 10 years and never heard a word of complaint from anyone." Hamish took a slow sip of his tea, letting the information settle. "And what about the mutton pie, Mrs. Kennedy? A strange thing to leave on a silver platter in a snowstorm." Mrs. Kennedy's eyes widened. "A mutton pie? Well, there's only one place that makes them with that braided crust, Hamish. That'll be Mrs. Gillespie's work. She sells them through the hotel. But why would she be giving one to a man like Thorne? He told her to her face that her cooking was clogged with suet and peasant nostalgia." "Peasant nostalgia," Hamish repeated, a dry smile touching his lips. "He really did have a way with words. Did anyone see him last night? Perhaps at the hotel?" "He was there," Mrs. Kennedy nodded vigorously. "He had a row with a young woman. Not a local, one of those fashionable types from down south. She arrived by taxi from the station. They were shouting in the dining room about money and some investment that had gone sour. She looked as though she wanted to claw his eyes out. And then she vanished. Some say she took the last bus out, but with the snow, I don't see how she could have." Hamish nodded, his mind filing away the fashionable woman alongside the mutton pie and the right-of-way dispute. He finished his tea and stood up, feeling the warmth returning to his limbs. "I'd best be moving on, Mrs. Kennedy. Blair will be looking for someone to shout at, and if I'm not careful, he'll find me." "You be careful, Hamish," she warned. "There's darkness in this snow. It's not just the cold." Hamish retreated to the street. The wind was picking up again, whistling through the narrow gaps between the stone houses. He didn't go back to the Croft. Instead, he made his way toward the Lochdu Hotel. If Thorne had been arguing with a woman over money, and if a mutton pie was involved, the hotel was the place where those two threads might cross. As he walked, he noticed the curtains twitching in the windows of the cottages. The village was watching. They knew Blair was a fool, and they knew Hamish was... Well, they weren't quite sure what Hamish was, which was exactly how he liked it. He looked like a man wandering aimlessly, perhaps looking for a lost sheep or a place to hide from his boss. But his eyes were sharp. He noted a set of tyre tracks that didn't belong to the police vehicles, thin, narrow tyres that had struggled in the slush. He stopped at the hotel's kitchen entrance. The smell of roasting lamb wafted out, and with it the sound of raised voices. Mrs. Gillespie was defending her territory against a junior constable who was trying to ask about her guest list. "I told you," Mrs. Gillespie's voice boomed. "I don't keep a log of every soul who buys a pie. They're for the public." Hamish leaned against the doorframe, looking perfectly harmless. "Now then, Mrs. Gillespie, don't be hard on the lad. He's just doing what the big men in Strathbane tell him. It's a terrible thing, a man dying in a garden. Makes everyone nervous." The junior constable looked at Hamish with relief, while Mrs. Gillespie softened slightly. "It's a disgrace, Hamish. That man Thorne was a menace. But a pie on a platter. That's not a murder, that's a statement." "Aye," Hamish agreed softly, his eyes moving to a stack of silver platters drying by the sink. They were identical to the one he had seen in the snow. A statement indeed. "And I wonder, did that young lady who was shouting at him yesterday happen to order one for the road?" Mrs. Gillespie paused, a look of realization flickering across her face. "She didn't order a pie, Hamish, but she did ask for a tray to be sent to her room, and when I went to collect it this morning the tray was gone, and so was she." Hamish thanked her and retreated into the cold. The pieces were beginning to drift together like the snow, but the picture they formed wasn't the one Blair was chasing. It wasn't a drunken accident, and it wasn't a local poacher's revenge. It was something far more calculated, hidden behind a mask of village life. The wind continued its mournful howl through the eaves of the Lochdu Hotel, a sound that usually made Hamish yearn for the depths of his own armchair. Instead, he found himself standing in the foyer, shaking the snow from his cap and trying to look as though he had no particular business being there. He was just beginning to wonder if the bar was open for a restorative drama when the heavy oak doors swung open, and a blast of cold air ushered in a figure that made his heart give a traitorous little skip. Priscilla Halberton Smythe looked remarkably elegant for a woman who had just braved a Highland blizzard. Her blonde hair was tucked neatly under a cashmere hat, and her cheeks were flushed a delicate rose by the frost. She was the daughter of the local gentry, a woman of grace and intelligence who had, over the years, become the unintentional custodian of Hamish's wandering affections. "Hamish," she said, her voice like a calm bell in the storm, "I heard the news at the big house. The village is buzzing like a disturbed hive. They say Percival Thorne has been found dead, and that there is a snowman involved." Hamish leaned against the reception desk, adopting his most casual slouch. "Aye, Priscilla. A very grand snowman. Seems Mr. Thorne's wild Highland experience took a turn for the permanent. DCI Blair is currently up there trying to arrest the scenery, but I fear he's looking at the wrong map." Priscilla stepped closer, her expression turning serious. "Was a dreadful man, Hamish. My father had the misfortune of dealing with him regarding a land boundary last month. Thorne wasn't just arrogant, he was desperate. He spoke like a man who had bet his last shilling on that retreat, and was terrified of losing. He treated everyone like an obstacle to be cleared away. Desperate men make many enemies," Hamish mused, "but it's the quiet ones who usually do something about it. I've been hearing stories of a young woman he was arguing with yesterday, a London type by all accounts. Mrs. Gillespie says she vanished this morning, along with a silver platter." Priscilla's brow furrowed in thought. "I saw her, Hamish. I was here for tea yesterday afternoon. She didn't look like a common tourist. She was wearing a coat that cost more than a small car, but she was clutching her handbag as if it contained her very soul. They were in the corner of the dining room. I couldn't hear everything, but I heard the name Vanguard. It sounded like a company, or a fund. Thorne was shouting that the money was tied up in the stone, and she told him that if he didn't pay her back, she'd make sure he never spent another penny." Hamish took a slow breath, absorbing the detail. Tied up in the stone, that would be the Croft then. He was using other people's money to build his palace, and if the money was gone, the lady would be wanting more than just an apology. "But Hamish," Priscilla said, laying a gloved hand on his arm, "there's something else. Something about how he was found. You mentioned the snowman was wearing his jacket. That seems theatrical, almost like a parody of his own vanity. Thorne was obsessed with his image. He'd spend hours telling anyone who would listen how he was rebranding the Highlands. "Aye," Hamish said softly, "and whoever killed him knew that. It wasn't just a murder, it was a mockery. A man like Blair sees a prank. I see a signature." He looked at Priscilla, appreciative of her sharp eyes. "You have a way of seeing the edges of things, Priscilla. Most people just see the middle. And most people see you as a lazy policeman who only cares about his next meal," she countered with a ghost of a smile. "But I know you're already 3 steps ahead of Blair. Just be careful. If this involves the kind of money Thorne was throwing around, there might be more than one person looking for a return on their investment." The romantic tension hung in the air, as it always did between them, a mixture of what might have been and the reality of their vastly different worlds. For a moment Hamish considered asking her to stay for a cup of coffee, to prolong the warmth of her company against the encroaching darkness of the case. But the sound of a heavy door slamming in the hallway announced the arrival of the Strathbane contingent. "Macbeth!" Blair's voice roared from the corridor. "If you're in there mooching free drinks while my men are freezing their appendages off, I'll have your badge for breakfast." Priscilla gave Hamish a sympathetic look. Duty calls, it seems, or at least the loud-mouthed version of it. "He has a very delicate constitution," Hamish whispered back, his eyes twinkling. "If he doesn't shout every 10 minutes, his blood stops circulating." As Priscilla walked away toward the hotel's private lounge, Hamish watched her for a second longer than was strictly professional. She had given him a vital clue, not a physical one, but a social one. Thorne wasn't just a victim of a grudge, he was a victim of a failed charade. The Highland retreat was a house of cards built on the grievances of the wealthy. Blair stomped into the foyer, his face a shade of plum that suggested he was nearing a physical limit. "There you are. We've found the woman's tracks. They lead to the old pier. We think she had a boat waiting. She's the killer, Macbeth. It's an open and shut case of a jilted mistress or a business partner gone rogue. I've alerted the Coast Guard." "In this weather, sir?" Hamish asked mildly. "A boat on the loch today would be like a cork in a washing machine. And besides, if she wanted him dead, why the snowman? Why the mutton pie? It seems like a lot of effort to go when you're trying to make a quick escape." "Because she's mental. That's why," Blair screamed. "They're all mental. Now get out and help Anderson clear the pier's snow. I want that area searched for a discarded weapon." Hamish sighed, the brief warmth of Priscilla's presence fading into the reality of Blair's incompetence. He knew the woman hadn't gone to the pier. He knew the killer was someone who didn't need a boat to disappear, someone who knew that in Loch Dhu, the best place to hide a secret was right under the nose of a man who thought he knew everything. "I'll get right on it, sir," Hamish said, picking up his cap. "Though I suspect the only thing we'll find at the pier is a very cold DCI and a lot of wet seaweed." He stepped back out into the freezing night, lugs trotting at his side. The mystery was deepening, and as the snow continued to fall, burying the village in a white silence, Hamish knew he had to look closer at the things that stayed behind, rather than the things that had supposedly fled. The Loch Dhu police station was not designed for high-stakes interrogations. It was designed for the occasional drunk fisherman, the lost tourist, and the very specific administrative task of dog licensing. Consequently, when Detective Chief Inspector Blair decided to turn the small front office into the headquarters of a murder investigation, the room instantly felt as crowded as a Glasgow tenement on a Friday night. Blair was pacing the floorboards, his heavy boots making the loose timber groan in protest. In the corner, huddled on the hard wooden bench, usually reserved for those waiting to report a lost sheep, sat Miss Lavinia Sterling. She had been found by Blair's men not at the pier, but shivering violently in the unheated waiting room of the desolate railway station 10 miles away, clutching a leather valise, and looking like an exotic bird blown off course by a hurricane. "So," Blair sneered, leaning over her until his red face was inches from her pale, tear-streaked one. "You thought you could just hop on the sleeper train and vanish, did you? Leave the body to freeze and the money to rot? I didn't kill him. Miss Sterling sobbed, her voice cracking. She was a striking woman, sharp-featured and impeccably groomed, though her mascara had now formed tragic rivulets down her cheeks. "I told you, I went there to demand my money back. He laughed at me. He told me the Highland retreat was a bottomless pit and my investment was the foundation. I was furious. I screamed at him. I may have thrown a vase. But he was alive when I left. He was drinking that foul whiskey and laughing. Laughing, was he?" Blair turned to his subordinates, Anderson and MacNab, with a triumphant grin. "Hear that? She admits to violence. She admits to a motive. It's a crime of passion. She snapped, bashed him over the head, or maybe poisoned his drink, dragged him outside, and built that snowman as a final insult. A woman scorned, eh? Classic." Hamish was standing by the stove, ostensibly making a pot of tea, but in reality watching the scene with the stillness of a heron in a reed bed. He poured a mug of tea, adding 2 sugars, and drifted over to the prisoner. "Here you are, miss," he said softly. "It's a cold night, waiting for trains that aren't running." "Macbeth," Blair barked, "stop coddling the suspect. She's going to Strathbane tonight, and she can have tea in her cell." "I was just thinking, sir," Hamish said, his voice trailing off into a hesitant mumble. "It's a very impressive theory, very dramatic. But there is a small matter of the mechanics." Blair's eyes bulged. "Mechanics? What are you babbling about now, you simpleton?" "Well," Hamish gestured vaguely with a teaspoon. "The snowman. It was a solid thing, sir, packed tight. Snow was wet and heavy yesterday. To roll 3 balls of that size, lift them on top of one another, that takes a back like an ox and arms like a docker. And then there's Mr. Thorne himself. He was a dead weight, lifting a grown man into a high chair, dressing him—" Hamish paused, allowing his gaze to drop meaningfully to Miss Sterling's hands. They were resting on her lap, trembling slightly. They were long, slender hands, ending in fingernails that were not merely manicured but sculpted. Long, pointed talons painted a deep crimson, each one perfect and unbroken. "Look at her nails, sir," Hamish observed, sounding as if he were commenting on the weather. If she had been rolling giant snowballs and wrestling a corpse in the freezing cold, those nails would be snapped, chipped, or at least caked with mud and ice. "And she has no gloves in her bag, does she?" Officer Anderson checked. Anderson cleared his throat nervously. "That's right, sir. No gloves. Just a silk scarf and some makeup. And then there are the shoes," Hamish continued, looking down at Miss Sterling's feet. She was wearing a pair of ankle boots that were undeniably stylish. Italian leather with a heel as thin as a pencil and at least 4 inches high. If she had stepped off the cleared path to build that snowman, she would have sunk to her knees. She'd have been stuck fast, but the snow around the snowman was packed by big flat boots. There were no holes from these spikes. Blair looked at the nails. He looked at the heels. The crimson flush on his face deepened, shifting from the colour of a plum to the colour of a raw steak. He hated logic, especially when it came from Hamish Macbeth, but he hated looking like a fool in court even more. A defence lawyer would tear the snowman theory apart in 10 seconds with one look at those shoes. She could have had an accomplice, Blair sputtered, grasping for a lifeline. A local man, someone she paid with what money Miss Sterling snapped, finding a sudden spark of courage in Hamish's defence. "Percival took everything. I couldn't even pay the taxi driver. I had to give him my watch. And then there is the pie," Hamish added gently. "The pie?" Blair roared. "Will you shut up about the bloody pie? It's just that," Hamish went on, ignoring the outburst. "Miss Sterling is from London. She's a lady of refined tastes. Would she know that Mrs. Gillespie at the Loch Dew Hotel bakes mutton pies on a Tuesday? Would she know to go to the kitchen door, speak to the cook, and buy a single pie to place on a platter? And even if she did, would she touch it?" Hamish looked at Miss Sterling. "Do you eat mutton, miss?" She looked horrified. "Good God, no. I'm a pescatarian, and I certainly wouldn't touch something that looked like that." The silence in the room was heavy. Blair stared at the woman, his open and shut case dissolving like snow in rain. The physical impossibility of the snowman, combined with the absurdity of the pie, made his theory look ridiculous. He knew it, and worse, he knew Hamish knew it. Fine. Blair threw his hands up, turning away in disgust. Fine. So she didn't build the snowman, but she was there. She argued with him. We'll hold her as a material witness, but if she didn't kill him, who did? Who else hated Thorn enough to turn him into a garden ornament? That is the question, sir, Hamish said, retreating to the safety of his stove. It would have to be someone strong, someone who knows the snow, someone who had access to the hotel kitchen to get the pie, and someone who knew Thorn was alone and vulnerable. Geordie! Blair turned, his eyes lighting up with renewed fanaticism. It comes back, poacher! He's strong, he lives in the snow, he eats those pies by the dozen. Anderson, get the car, we're going to tear down his old cabin. I don't care if we have to dig the whole mountain. I want that bearded savage in cuffs by morning. As the detectives stampeded out of the station, leaving the door banging in the wind, Miss Sterling looked at Hamish with wide, bewildered eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I think you just saved me." "I just pointed out the shoes, miss," Hamish said, pouring himself a fresh cup of coffee. "DCI Blair is a man of great vision, but sometimes he misses the ground beneath his feet." But as he sipped the hot, dark liquid, Hamish's mind wasn't on the shoes or the nails. It was on the mutton pie. Blair had dismissed it, but Hamish knew it was the key. Mrs. Gillespie sold those pies to the locals. She sold them to farmers, fishermen, and crofters. She didn't sell them to tourists. The killer wasn't a stranger. The killer was someone who belonged here. Someone who had walked into the hotel kitchen, bought a pie, walked up the hill, and killed a man, all without raising a single eyebrow. The killer was someone invisible. Hamish looked out the window at the swirling dark. He knew who he had to visit next. Not Geordie. Geordie was too obvious. He needed to speak to someone who had been quietly cleaning up messes in Loch Dew for a very long time. The wind had shifted, coming down from the north with a bite that felt less like weather and more like a personal grudge. Hamish Macbeth left the warmth of the police station, not to follow the chaotic cavalcade of DCI Blair's vehicles that were currently tearing up the track to Geordie's shack, but to walk in the opposite direction. He moved with the slow, deliberate plod of a man who had nowhere to be, though his mind was racing faster than the clouds scudding across the moon. Blair was chasing a phantom. He was looking for a monster, a wild man of the woods, a jilted lover, a financial shark. But the murder of Percival Thorn didn't feel like the work of a monster. It felt like a neighbour's job. The staging of the body, the snowman, the pie, it was all too intimate. It was a gesture of contempt, a way of reducing a man who thought he was a god into something ridiculous. It was the kind of thing a Highlander did when they couldn't sue you and wouldn't shoot you. They mocked you for eternity. Hamish's boots led him away from the village square and toward a small slate-roofed cottage on the edge of the moor. Smoke was curling lazily from the chimney, a welcoming grey ribbon against the black sky. This was the home of Tam Brodie, the village stonemason and handyman. Tam was a man who was as much a part of the landscape as the granite boulders he worked with, large, silent, and generally ignored by anyone who didn't need a wall fixed or a driveway cleared. He was the invisible man, the man who had been up at the Croft for weeks, fixing the storm damage that Thorn had complained about incessantly, the man who would have known exactly where the garden furniture was stored, and who would have had the sheer physical strength to roll 3 massive boulders of snow into the shape of a man. Hamish knocked on the door. It wasn't an official knock. It was the gentle tap of a friend looking for a warm corner. The door opened, and Tam stood there, silhouetted by the firelight. He was a bear of a man, with hands the size of shovels and a face weathered by 50 years of Highland winters. He looked at Hamish, then at the darkness behind him. "Hamish," he grunted, "you'll be wanting a drama, I expect. It's a night for it." "You are a mind-reader, Tam," Hamish said, stepping inside and stamping the snow from his boots. Lugs followed, immediately locating the rug in front of the fire and collapsing onto it with a groan of ecstasy. The cottage was sparse but warm. It smelled of peat smoke, wet wool, and sawdust. Hamish settled into a battered armchair, accepting the glass of whisky Tam offered. He did not immediately discuss the murder. That wasn't the way. You had to talk around the subject, like a sheepdog circling a flock, before you could drive it home. Blair is out chasing Geordie, Hamish said, taking a sip. I think he did it. Thinks Geordie lured the Englishman out and froze him to death. Tam sat opposite, his massive frame dwarfing the chair. He stared into the fire, his expression unreadable. Geordie? He rumbled. Geordie wouldn't waste a good pie on a dead man. Geordie would have eaten the pie and left the man to the foxes. Aye, that's what I thought, Hamish agreed. It's a specific kind of anger, isn't it? Dress a man like a doll, to give him a snowman for company. It's like saying, here you are, you cold-hearted bastard. Here's a friend who's just like you. Tam's hand tightened slightly on his glass. Thorn was a bad man, Hamish. He didn't understand the stone. He wanted me to build a wall, a feature wall, he called it, out of plastic bricks. Plastic. Said the real stone was too dirty. Said it looked primitive. Hamish watched him over the rim of his glass. That's an insult to a man's trade, Tam, to ask a mason to work with plastic. He laughed at me, Tam said, his voice dropping to a low growl. I presented him with the bill for the roof repairs. It wasn't much, just for slate and work. He took the paper, crumpled it, and threw it in the mud. He said, I don't pay for peasant work, I pay for vision. Then he told me to get off his land before he set the dogs on me. He didn't even have dogs, Hamish. Just that fancy car and his loud voice. Hamish felt the pieces click together with the satisfying weight of a well-set lintel. The motive wasn't the millions of pounds in the hedge fund, it wasn't the affair or the land rights. It was 50 quid and a wounded pride. Thorn had stripped a proud man of his dignity before his own work. He was drinking heavily last night, Hamish said softly. After the woman left, he would have been stumbling about. Maybe he came outside to shout at the weather. Maybe, Tam said, not looking away from the fire. Or maybe someone helped him outside. Maybe someone just wanted him to sit and listen once. To sit still and see what the cold really feels like when you don't have your central heating, and your fancy gilets to protect you. Hamish looked at Tam's boots, drying by the door. They were heavy work boots, the kind that left a flat, broad print, the kind that would flatten the snow around a crime scene so effectively that it looked like a dance floor. And on the table, next to a pile of unpaid bills, was a small, grease-stained paper bag from the Lochdu Hotel kitchen. It's a terrible thing, anger, Hamish mused, swirling his whiskey. It eats you up. But justice is also funny. Blair wants a villain. He wants a mastermind. He won't look twice at a man who fixes walls. He thinks people like you and me are just part of the scenery. Tam finally looked up. His eyes were tired, filled with a resignation that was more tragic than frightening. He was a small man, Hamish. For all his money, he was small. And he looked even smaller sitting next to that snowman. The snowman had more heart. Hamish didn't say anything. He didn't recite the caution. He didn't reach for handcuffs. He simply finished his drink and set the glass down. He knew now. He knew the who and the why. Tam hadn't meant to kill him, perhaps. Or maybe he had. Maybe he just sat him in that chair, drunk and raving, and told him to cool off. And then, in a fit of poetic justice, he had built the snowman to keep watch. The tragedy was, Tam was a good man, a useful man. Thorn had been a parasite. But the law was a blunt instrument, much like the one Blair was trying to wield. Hamish needed a way to resolve this that didn't end with Tam Brodie rotting in a cell in Inverness while Blair pretended for the cameras. I'd best be going, Tam, Hamish said, standing up. Blair will be finished with Geordie soon, and he'll be looking for someone else to blame. He's a man who needs a confession. He doesn't care much where it comes from, as long as it's loud. Tam nodded slowly. Aye. Safe home, Hamish. As Hamish walked back into the biting wind, he knew he couldn't just arrest Tam. That would be the city way. He needed a trap. Not to catch Tam, but to force the truth out in a way that gave Hamish control over the outcome. He needed to make Blair witness the confession, but he also needed to ensure the context, the bullying, the provocation, was clear. He needed to stage a finale as theatrical as the snowman itself. Hamish patted Lug's head. Come on, boy. We have a trap to set, and I'm afraid we're going to have to be very clever, for Tam is no fool, and Blair is... well, Blair is Blair. The police station was vibrating with the force of Detective Chief Inspector Blair's indignation. He had returned from the hunt for Geordie the poacher, not with a handcuffed savage, but with the humiliating knowledge that Geordie had spent the entire evening of the murder in the manse, playing dominoes with the Free Presbyterian minister. A more ironclad alibi did not exist in the Highlands. Blair was currently taking his frustration out on the filing cabinet, kicking the bottom drawer repeatedly while his subordinates, Anderson and MacNab, tried to blend into the wallpaper. Hamish Macbeth sat at his desk, carefully polishing the buttons of his tunic, looking for all the world like a man whose only concern was the upcoming inspection, rather than the resolution of a homicide. "It's a conspiracy!" Blair shouted, his face a terrifying shade of beetroot. "They're all in on it, minister, poacher, postmistress. They're laughing at me, Macbeth. I can feel it. I'll arrest a lot of them for perverting the course of justice." "Aye, sir," Hamish said soothingly, buffing a brass button with a rag. "It's a terrible thing when the facts don't fit the theory. But I've been thinking, sir, about the money." Blair stopped kicking the cabinet. "Money? What money? The woman said it was gone." "Exactly," Hamish said, leaning back and looking at the ceiling. Thorne was a man who liked to hide things. He told people he was broke, but men like that always have a squirrel fund. And where would you hide a fortune in gold or bonds in a place like this? You wouldn't trust the banks, you'd trust the land. Hamish paused, letting the bait dangle. He saw the greed flicker in Blair's watery eyes. "Go on," Blair growled. "Well," Hamish continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "I was up at the Croft earlier, just checking the seals on the windows as you ordered, and I noticed something odd about that new stone wall in the garden. One of the stones looked loose, and when I tapped it, it sounded hollow. Now, I'm not a detective of your caliber, sir, but if I were a man hiding a fortune, I'd put it inside a double-skinned granite wall where no one would think to look." Blair's eyes widened. "The wall. Of course. It's the perfect safe. And that's why he was there. He was checking his stash when the killer struck." "It makes sense, sir," Hamish nodded sagely. "And if the killer didn't find the money, they might be coming back for it, especially if they hear a rumour. A rumour, aye. If word got out that the great DCI Blair has ordered a demolition team to come up tomorrow morning and tear that wall apart stone by stone, well, anyone who knew about the money would have to make a move tonight, wouldn't they?" Blair rubbed his hands together, the prospect of recovering a stolen fortune, and the glory that came with it, erasing his earlier humiliation. Brilliant. For a village idiot, Macbeth, you have your moments. Anderson, get on the radio. I want a leak planted. Tell the landlady at the pub that we're bringing in the heavy diggers at dawn. Tell her we think there's bullion in the garden." "I'll do it, sir," Hamish volunteered, standing up. "I need to buy some dog food anyway. I will just mention it to Mrs. MacGregor. She has a tongue that could transmit a signal to the moon." "Do it," Blair commanded, "and then we stake out the Croft, tonight. If anyone comes near that wall, we nail them." Hamish walked out into the cold night air, a grim satisfaction settling in his gut. It was a cruel trap in a way. He knew there was no gold. He knew there was no fortune. But he knew what was in that wall. He suspected that when Tam Brodie had been insulted and stiffed on his bill, he had crumbled up the paper invoice, the proof of his work and Thorne's debt, and jammed it into the gap between the stones in a fit of rage before storming off. Or perhaps he had hidden the very tool he had used to threaten Thorne. Whatever it was something that tied Tam to the scene, and the threat of the wall's destruction would be too much for the stonemason's pride and paranoia. Hamish made his way to the pub, the warmth and noise washing over him. He ordered a pint and a packet of crisps, leaning on the bar next to Mrs. MacGregor. Terrible business, Hamish sighed loudly. And it's getting louder. DCI Blair is convinced Thorne hid gold in that garden wall. He's got a demolition crew coming from Inverness at first light, going to smash the whole thing down. Pity, really. It's a fine bit of masonry. He saw the local's ears prick up. He saw glances exchanged. In the corner, a man who worked with Tam on the roads finished his drink quickly and slipped out the side door. The signal was sent. The trap was primed. Hamish finished his drink and returned to the station, where Blair was already arming himself as if for a siege. "The word is out, sir," Hamish reported. "If there's a rat, he'll smell the cheese." The stakeout was a miserable affair. The wind had dropped, but the cold had intensified, turning the air a razor. Hamish, Blair, Anderson and MacNab lay huddled in the bracken surrounding the Croft house, their breath misting in the moonlight. Hamish had ensured he was positioned slightly downwind, wrapped in his thickest woolens, while Blair was shivering violently in his regulation city-issue trench coat. Hours passed. The snowman stood sentinel in the centre of the garden, a ghostly white figure overseeing the empty house. The silence was absolute, broken only by the chattering of Blair's teeth. "This is a waste of time," Blair hissed, his patience fraying. "There's no one coming. You've made a fool of me again, Macbeth." "Hush, sir," Hamish whispered, his hand clamping onto Blair's arm. "Look." A shadow had detached itself from the darkness of the tree line. It was a large, hulking shape, moving with surprising stealth across the snow-covered lawn. It didn't hit home. It didn't go to the snowman. It went straight to the dry stone wall that ran along the perimeter of the patio. The figure knelt in the snow. The moonlight caught the glint of metal, a chisel perhaps, or a knife. The man began to work at one of the coping stones, his movements frantic and heavy. "That's him!" Blair shrieked, unable to contain himself a second longer. "Police! Stay where you are!" Blair scrambled up from the bracken, tripping over a hidden root and face-planting into a snowdrift before scrambling up again, waving his torch wildly. Anderson and MacNab charged forward, their flashlights cutting through the dark, pinning the figure against the wall. The man stood up slowly, dropping the stone he had been prying loose. He raised his large hands in the air, shielding his eyes from the glare. It was, as Hamish knew it would be, Tam Brodie. "Got you!" Blair yelled, panting as he reached the patio. "Caught red-handed. Digging for the gold, were you? Where is it? Where's the loot?" Tam looked at Blair with a mixture of fear and deep, weary contempt. "There is no gold," he rumbled, his voice like grinding gravel. "That's just my work. I wasn't going to let you smash it. It's a good wall. It's the only honest thing on this whole cursed hill." "Don't lie to me," Blair shouted, grabbing Tam by the lapels of his jacket. "You killed him. You killed him for the money and hid it in the wall." "I didn't kill him for money," Tam said, and his eyes flickered over to where Hamish emerged from the shadows. "I killed him because he was a hollow man. He was empty, and I filled the silence." Hamish entered the circle of light. He saw the crumpled ball of paper that Tam had managed to extract from the wall before the lights hit him. It lay in the snow at his feet. Hamish bent down and took it. He smoothed it out. It wasn't a bank bond. It wasn't a deed. It was an invoice for £54. 50 for repair of storm damage and stone walling. Across the front, in red ink, Thorne had written, "Void, substandard." "It wasn't a robbery, sir," Hamish said quietly, handing the paper to Blair. "It was an unpaid bill, and a broken heart." Blair looked at the paper, then at Tam, and for a moment he looked almost disappointed that the grand conspiracy had shrunk down to 50 quid and a stonemason's pride. But a collar was a collar. "Cuff him," Blair ordered, his voice flat. "Read him his rights. And for God's sake, someone get me a heater." Hamish watched them lead Tam away. The trap had worked. The case was solved. But as the flashing lights began to illuminate the snow once more, Hamish felt no triumph. He only felt the cold, and the knowledge that Loch had lost a good builder and gained another ghost. The trek down from the Croft to the waiting police vehicles was a procession of misery. The adrenaline of the capture had faded, replaced by the biting reality of the Highland winter and the treacherous, icy footing of the track. Tam Brodie walked in the centre of the group, his large hands cuffed behind his back, his head bowed against the wind. Flanking him were Anderson and MacNab, who looked like a pair of nervous terriers escorting a bear. Bringing up the rear, and keeping a safe distance from the prisoner, was Detective Chief Inspector Blair. Now that the danger was ostensibly over, Blair's courage had returned with a vengeance, manifesting as a stream of vitriolic commentary that cut through the silence of the glen. "I knew it the moment I saw him," Blair boasted, his voice loud enough to wake the sleeping sheep. "Look at his size. A brute. It takes a brute to crush a man's skull and then play with snowballs. You're a sick animal, Brodie, that's what you are. A sick, primitive animal." Hamish, walking a few paces behind Blair with lugs at his heels, felt a tightening in his chest. He knew men like Tam. They were slow to anger, like the dormant volcanoes of the ancient landscape, but when they erupted, the devastation was total. Tam wasn't listening to the wind, he was listening to Blair. "You'll rot in Barlinnie for this," Blair continued, slipping on a patch of ice and recovering with a curse. "And I'll make sure the press knows everything. The killer Mason. I can see the headlines now. We'll tear that cottage of yours apart looking for more evidence. Probably find you've been burying sheep carcasses in the garden, too. Inbred savages, the lot of you." Hamish saw Tam's shoulders tense. It was a subtle movement, a shifting of muscle under the heavy wool jacket, like a coiled spring tightening. "Sir!" Hamish shouted, his voice sharp with warning. "I think it would be best to keep the talk for the station. The path is slippery and the prisoner is—" "Quiet, Macbeth," Blair snapped over his shoulder. "I don't need advice from a constable who can barely tie his own shoelaces. I'm enjoying this. It's not often we catch a monster red-handed." He turned back to Tam, stepping closer, his face twisted in a sneer. "Did he beg, Brodie? Did the Englishman beg for his life while you were freezing him to death? I bet that made you feel big, didn't it? A big man with a big grudge and a tiny brain. That was the spark. The explosion of violence was so sudden it seemed to freeze time." Tam Brodie didn't shout. He simply stopped. With a guttural roar that sounded like rocks grinding together, he wrenched his arms apart. The handcuffs, old and likely rusted, didn't snap, but the force of the movement sent Anderson and Mac Nab flying into the snowdrifts as if they were made of straw. Tam spun around, his eyes wild and devoid of humanity, fixed entirely on Blair. Blair's sneer vanished. He let out a high-pitched squeak of terror, stumbling backward. "Stay back! Anderson! Shoot him! Shoot him!" But Anderson was flailing in a ditch, and Mac Nab was trying to locate his glasses in the snow. Tam took a step toward Blair, his cuffed hands raised like a double-fisted hammer. He looked less like a man and more like a mythical giant from the old tales, seeking vengeance for 1,000 years of insults. "You talk too much," Tam growled, his voice trembling with rage. "You small, noisy man." He lunged. Blair turned to run, but his city shoes betrayed him on the black ice. He went down hard, sprawling on his back, his arms raised in a pathetic attempt to ward off the blow that was sure to crush his ribs. Tam towered over him, the moonlight casting a long, terrifying shadow across the DCI's face. "Tam, no!" Hamish moved. He didn't run, he flowed. He closed the distance between them with a burst of speed that belied his usual loping gait. As Tam brought his fists down, Hamish didn't try to block the blow. That would have been suicide. Instead, he threw his own body weight against Tam's hip, hooking his leg behind the stonemason's knee in a classic shinty trip. Physics took over. Tam, already off balance from the force of his own swing, teetered. Hamish grabbed the collar of Tam's jacket and used the man's own momentum to guide him. The giant crashed into the snow, missing Blair's head by inches. The impact shook the ground. Before Tam could scramble, Hamish was on him. He wasn't trying to hurt him, he was simply applying pressure, a knee to the shoulder blade, a hand pressing the man's face into the cooling snow. "Stay down, Tam," Hamish whispered urgently into his ear. "Don't make it worse. He's not worth it. Think of the wall. Think of the work. Don't let a man like that turn you into a murderer twice." Tam struggled for a second, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Then he collapsed, the fight draining out of him as quickly as it had arrived. He lay in the snow sobbing, Great, heaving sobs that shook his massive frame. He wouldn't pay. Tam wept into the ice. He wouldn't pay. And he offered me a pie. He threw it at me, said it was dog food, said I should eat it off the ground like the animal I was. Hamish kept his hand on Tam's shoulder, his grip firm but comforting. "So you put the pie on the platter," Hamish murmured, "to show him. To show him you weren't an animal." "I hit him," Tam confessed, his voice muffled. "Just once." He fell back into the chair. He didn't get up. "I didn't mean to kill him, Hamish. I just wanted him to stop laughing, and he looked so cold. I thought he needed a jacket. And a friend. So I built the man, the cold man, because that's what he was." Blair was scrambling to his feet, hyperventilating, his face pale as death. He looked at Hamish, who was effectively holding down a giant with one hand, and then at the sobbing prisoner. He wiped a mixture of snot and snow from his face, trying to regain some shred of dignity. I subdued him," Blair stammered, his voice shaking. "You saw that, Anderson?" He lunged, and I manoeuvred him into position for Macbeth to assist. Anderson, who was pulling himself out of the ditch, looked at his boss with open disbelief, but knew better than to argue. "Yes, sir. Very brave, sir." Hamish stood up slowly, hauling Tam to his feet. He brushed the snow off the stonemason's jacket, treating him not as a criminal, but as a tragedy. "Come on, Tam. The car is warm. No more fighting. It's done now." Tam nodded, broken. He walked quietly to the car, stepping carefully around Blair, who flinched as he passed. As they loaded him into the back seat, Hamish leaned against the roof of the car, his breath blooming in the cold air. His heart was hammering against his ribs, but his face remained impassive. He looked at Blair, who was now shouting into his radio, demanding backup and claiming to have engaged in hand-to-hand combat with a crazed maniac. "You all right, Hamish?" It was Priscilla. She had driven up to the edge of the police cordon, her headlights cutting through the gloom. She rolled down her window, looking concerned. "Aye, Priscilla," Hamish said, walking toward her. "Just a bit of a disagreement about the bill. It's all settled now. You saved that horrible man's life, didn't you?" she asked, glancing at Blair. "I suppose," Hamish shrugged, "though I doubt he'll see it that way. In his version, I expect he'll have judo chopped the giant while I was cowering in the bushes. And the killer? Tam Brodie," Hamish said sadly. "A good man pushed too far by a bad one. Thorne treated people like things, and Tam treated him like a statue. It's a cold kind of justice, but it's justice all the same." The adrenaline was fading, leaving Hamish feeling hollowed out and incredibly hungry. He looked at the flashing lights, the shouting detectives, and the handcuffed mason. He had solved the crime, saved his boss, and caught the killer. For his trouble, he would likely get a reprimand for not wearing his hat during the arrest. "Go home, Hamish," Priscilla said softly. "I'll see you tomorrow." "Aye," Hamish said. "Home sounds good." But he knew the night wasn't over. There was still the matter of the credit, and Hamish Macbeth had one final card to play to ensure that DCI Blair took the glory, and the departure ticket that came with it. The morning sun struggled to crest the mountains of Sutherland, casting a pale, watery light over the village of Loch-Dhu. The snow from the previous days had begun to turn into a treacherous grey slush in the streets, but around the police station, the atmosphere was electric with the heat of a media circus. Detective Chief Inspector Blair was in his element. He stood in front of the station mirror, a piece of glass that usually reflected only Hamish Macbeth's unkempt hair and the occasional spider, and adjusted his tie with the precision of a surgeon. Hamish sat at his desk, nursing a mug of coffee and looking for all the world like a man who had just woken up from a nap he hadn't deserved. He was watching Blair preen. The DCI had applied a generous amount of hair oil, which made his scalp gleam under the harsh fluorescent lights, and he was practicing his somber but triumphant expression for the gathering reporters outside. "It's a madhouse out there, sir," Hamish observed quietly, breaking a piece of shortbread for lugs. "The press from Inverness, the radio people, even a BBC van. You've drawn quite a crowd." Blair turned, his face flushed with adrenaline and vanity. "Of course I have, Macbeth. It's a major crime. A wealthy financier murdered in a ritualistic fashion, a manhunt in a blizzard, and a violent confrontation with a deranged killer. It's the stuff of legends, and I, of course, was at the helm." "Aye, sir," Hamish agreed, his voice devoid of any irony. "It was a masterclass. I don't know how you put it together. The wall, the psychological pressure on Tam. It was very subtle." Blair narrowed his eyes, looking for the mockery he always suspected lurked beneath Hamish's placid exterior. Finding none, he puffed out his chest. "Experience, Macbeth. That's what it is. I knew from the start it wasn't the woman. That was too easy. I needed to flush out the real beast. That's why I ordered the leak about the gold. I knew Brodie's greed, or his guilt, would draw him back. And the arrest, sir," Hamish prodded gently. "That will be the part they want to hear about. The fight in the snow." Blair hesitated slightly. He remembered the terrifying sight of Tam Brodie towering over him, the fist descending like a sledgehammer, and the sudden blurring motion of Hamish intervening. But the memory was already rewriting itself in his mind, smoothing over the edges of his own terror and highlighting his command of the situation. "Yes, well," Blair coughed, straightening his jacket. "It was touch and go. The man is a giant, but I could see he was unstable. When he lunged, I held my ground. I knew I had to distract him to allow you to stumble into him." "That's right, sir," Hamish said, nodding enthusiastically. "I was terrified. I tried to run away, slipped on the ice and accidentally knocked his legs out from under him. If you hadn't been shouting orders and confusing him with your authority, he'd likely have crushed me flat. It was your command voice that froze him, sir." Blair smiled. It was a greasy, satisfied smile. "You are a clumsy oaf, Macbeth, but I suppose your incompetence has its uses. I'll mention in my report that you provided distractionary support. I can't have headquarters thinking I'm working with total invalids, even if it is true." "Thank you, sir, I'd appreciate that. I wouldn't want to look too heroic. You know how I hate the fuss." "Heroic?" Blair scoffed, laughing a harsh, barking laugh. "Don't worry, laddie. No one is going to mistake you for a hero. You look like a scarecrow that's been dragged through a hedge backward. Now get me a fresh cup of coffee. The superintendent is on his way down, and I want to be sharp." Hamish rose and went to the stove. This was the most dangerous part of the investigation, not the killer, but the paperwork. If the superintendent thought for 1 second that Hamish Macbeth had shown initiative, intelligence, or physical prowess, the wheels of bureaucracy would turn. They would talk about wasted potential. They would talk about a transfer to the serious crime squad in Glasgow or Edinburgh. They would try to promote him. And Hamish would rather die than leave Loch Dhu. He loved the mountains. He loved his sheep. He loved the fact that he could spend 3 hours staring at a loch and call it surveillance. A promotion meant a desk, a tie, and a city full of noise. He brought the coffee to Blair, placing it carefully on the desk next to the official arrest report. "I've typed up the preliminary notes for you, sir. Just the facts. Suspect apprehended at the scene. Confession secured regarding the unpaid debt and the emotional distress. I left the tactical takedown section blank for you to fill in." Blair glanced at the paper. "Good. At least you can type. I'll handle the narrative. We need to emphasize forensic foresight, the snowman profile. I want the press to know that. I understood the symbolism of the crime scene." "The snowman profile," Hamish repeated, tasting the words. "That sounds very modern, very psychological." "It is," Blair said, picking up a pen. "I saw the snowman not as a prank, but as a manifestation of the killer's desire to freeze time, to freeze his victim. It was obvious to a trained eye." Hamish went back to his desk and sat down, hiding a smile behind his hand. Blair had kicked the snowman and called it a joke only yesterday, but now it was his magnum opus. The phone rang. It was the shrill, demanding ring of the direct line from Strathbane. Blair snatched it up. "DCI Blair speaking," he barked. His tone softened almost immediately. "Ah, Superintendent." "Yes, sir. I caught him last night, a local stonemason, a brute of a man. Yes, he resisted, violently. I had to engage physically. A few bruises, nothing I can't handle. Macbeth? Oh, he was present. He managed not to get in the way, which is a victory in itself. Hamish listened to his character being assassinated with a sense of deep relief. Every insult was a brick in the wall that protected his life in Loch Dhu. Yes, sir, Blair continued, puffing on a cigarette. I agree. It shows the need for strong leadership in these remote areas. The local policing is LAX. They get too close to the community. They miss the signs. If I hadn't come up, this case would have gone cold. Literally. Blair laughed at his own joke. He listened a moment longer, then nodded. A commendation? That's very kind of you, sir. I'll be sure to pass on a well done to the team. Yes, I'll be back in Strathbane this afternoon. I can't wait to get back to civilization. The coffee here is sludge and the people are worse. He slammed the phone down and turned to Hamish, beaming. Did you hear that? The superintendent is delighted. He's talking about a citation for bravery. For me, obviously. Congratulations, sir, Hamish said. You deserve it. It was a cold stakeout. It was hell, Blair corrected. But it's done. The van is loaded. Anderson has the prisoner secured. I'm doing the press conference, and then we are leaving this god-forsaken rock pile. And Macbeth? Yes, sir. Do try to look a bit more professional in the future. If I have to come back up here because you've lost another body or let a poacher run wild, I won't be so forgiving. I'll have you on traffic duty in the city centre so fast your head will spin. I'll do my best, sir, Hamish promised, widening his eyes in mock terror. I'll stick to the sheep dipping and the lost dogs. Murder is a bit too much excitement for a quiet man like me. It certainly is, Blair sneered. He checked his reflection one last time, smoothed his hair, and marched out the door to face the flashing cameras. Hamish watched him go. Through the window, he saw the reporters swarm around Blair like midges. He saw the microphones thrust into the DCI's face. He saw Blair gesturing expansively, acting out the struggle with the giant stonemason, looking every inch the hero the public wanted. Hamish sighed and leaned back in his chair. The station was quiet again. The smell of Blair's cheap cologne was already beginning to fade, replaced by the comforting scent of peat smoke and damp dog. Well, Lugs, Hamish said, reaching down to scratch the dog behind the ears. We survived. Tam will get a manslaughter charge, likely. A crime of passion. He'll serve a few years, but the judge will hear about the provocation. And we get to stay here. He stood up and walked to the stove, pouring the rest of the coffee down the sink. He opened the cupboard and took out a small, battered tin. He measured out 2 scoops of fresh, dark roast. The good stuff he hid when Blair was around. Now, Hamish said, waiting for the kettle to boil as the sound of the police convoy fading into the distance brought a profound silence back to the glen. Let's have a proper cup of coffee. And then I suppose I'd better go and see if Mrs. MacGregor has any of those bacon rolls left. Being useless is hungry work. The credit had been successfully shifted. The danger of promotion had passed. The High Constable of Loch Dhu was safe in his kingdom. The mountains, indifferent to the dramas of men, stood watch in the snow. The silence that descended upon Loch Dhu following the departure of the Strathbane police convoy was not merely an absence of noise. It was a physical weight, heavy and soft like a wet wool blanket. The sirens had faded, the reporters had packed away their cameras, and the flashing blue lights had been swallowed by the grey ribbon of the road leading south. For the first time in 3 days, the village belonged to itself. Hamish Macbeth stood in the doorway of the police station, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed. He watched the last of the media vans disappear around the bend of the loch, leaving behind only a trail of muddy tyre tracks and the lingering scent of diesel fumes. He took a deep breath, inhaling the sharp, clean air of the Atlantic. It smelled of salt, peat, and the coming rain that would wash away the snow. The wild Highland experience was officially over. He turned back into the office. It was a mess. Blair had left the place looking like a campsite for unruly teenagers. Cigarette ash dusted the floor, coffee cups with dregs of cold liquid sat on every surface, and the filing cabinet was still slightly dented from the DCI's earlier temper tantrum. Hamish felt a sudden burst of energy, not for policing, but for reclaiming his sanctuary. He opened the windows wide, letting the freezing wind blast through the room to exorcise the smell of cheap aftershave and city ambition. He swept the floor with a rhythmic swish of the broom, while Lugs, sensing the return of the natural order, curled up in his basket and went immediately to sleep. Once the station was purged of Blair's presence, Hamish felt the familiar pang of hunger. It was a specific kind of hunger that came after high stress, a need for comfort rather than just fuel. He locked the door, a symbolic gesture, as no one in Lochdu locked their doors, and made his way down the waterfront. The village was waking up from the drama. Curtains were pulled back, and the normal rhythm of life was reasserting itself. As Hamish passed the curry shop, the door swung open, and the spicy, rich aroma of cumin and coriander wafted out into the street. Mr. Patel stood there, beaming. The threat to his ventilation system had died with Percival Thorne. "Mr. Macbeth!" Patel shouted, waving a ladle. "You are looking thin. The big shouty man is gone?" "He is gone, Mr. Patel," Hamish smiled. "Back to the city where people appreciate his volume." "Good, good. A terrible man. But he is gone and the air is free again. You come in later? I make lambuna, very hot. Good for the cold." "I will be there," Hamish promised. The curry shop was safe, the stone walls were safe, the village had survived another invasion. He continued his walk toward the hotel. He needed to see Priscilla. There was a loose end that needed tying, not for the police report, but for his own conscience. He found her in the lounge, sitting by the fire with a book she wasn't reading. She looked up as he approached, her blue eyes searching his face. "Is he gone?" she asked quietly. "Blair?" "Aye. He's likely halfway to Inverness by now, rehearsing his speech for the commissioner. He'll be a hero by supper time." "And Tam?" Hamish sat down opposite her, sinking into the plush armchair. "Tam is in a cell in Strathbane. But I spoke to the sergeant on the desk, a man who owes me a favour for a quiet word I had with his son regarding a poaching matter. He says Tam is calm. He's eaten. He's sleeping." Priscilla nodded. "I spoke to my father. He was surprisingly sympathetic. He remembers Tam fixing the chimney stacks at the big house when no one else would go up in the high winds. Father has retained a solicitor from Edinburgh, a very good one. He says that given the provocation, the lack of intent, and, well, Blair's incompetence in securing the scene, they'll likely push for a suspended sentence or a short stay in a low-security facility. Tam won't die in prison, Hamish." Hamish let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The guilt of the trap had been gnawing at him. He had used Tam to save himself from Blair, but he hadn't wanted to destroy the man. "That is good news, Priscilla. You are a wonder." "I'm just protecting the village assets," she said, though her smile was warm. "Good stonemasons are harder to find than good policemen." "Och, you're hard on a man," Hamish laughed softly. "But you're right. I'm easily replaced. A man like Tam is part of the rock." They sat in companionable silence for a moment. The romantic tension was there, as always, a low hum in the background. But today it felt settled. They were allies. They were keepers of this strange, isolated place. "What will happen to the Croft?" Hamish asked. "The bank will take it," Priscilla said. "The Highland retreat was a fantasy. It will sit empty for a while, and then hopefully someone local will buy it back for the price of the land. Sheep will graze the garden again. The wind will knock down those silly plastic walls inside. And the snowman? I suspect nature is taking care of that." Hamish stood up. "I'd best be getting back. Lugs will be wondering where his dinner is, and if I leave him too long, he starts looking at my shoes with culinary intent." He returned in the afternoon. The temperature had risen, and a soft, persistent rain had begun to fall, washing the white from the hills. He looked up toward the McCrae Croft. Through the mist he could just make out the white shape in the garden. It was leaning now, listening to the side. The snowman, the silent witness, the mockery of a man, was returning to the water table. The gilet would be found in a puddle in a few days, a sodden remnant of vanity. Hamish returned to the police station. It was dark inside now, the gloom of the winter afternoon settling in. He didn't turn on the main lights. Instead, he lit the paraffin lamp on his desk and stoked the peat stove until it roared. He filled the kettle and set it on the hot plate. He sat down in his chair, stretching his long legs out toward the warmth. He thought about the ambition that drove men like Thorne and Blair. The need to be seen, be loud, own things, control things. It seemed exhausting. Thorne was dead in a drawer, Blair was exhausted and angry in a city, Tam was in a cell. And Hamish? Hamish was warm. He had a pot of coffee brewing, he had a dog snoring at his feet, he had promised Lamboona later. He had solved a murder without doing any actual work that the heavy hand of the law could recognize. He picked up a book, a paperback western he had read 3 times before, and opened it to page 1. The phone on his desk remained silent. The radio was turned off. The village of Lochdu was quiet, its secrets buried once again under rain and rock. "Aye, lugs," Hamish murmured, closing his eyes for just a moment as the smell of coffee filled the room. "Let them have their cities and their commendations. We have the stove, and I think on balance we have the better deal." He took a sip of the coffee, strong and black, and settled deeper into the chair. PC Hamish Macbeth was back on duty, which meant, for all intents and purposes, he was absolutely, blissfully, doing nothing at all.